Meanwhile, the third component of the assault from the lagoon was falling into place on the eastern side of the Burns-Phil Pier. Major Jim Crow's 2nd Battalion of the 8th Marines was coming in on Red 3. In comparison to the raging battles to the west, enemy fire was light on Red 3, but comparison mattered little to the keyed-up men in the assault waves. Shells hit the reef, and machine gun and rifle fire swept 3 feet above the surface of the water. Although not the overwhelming enemy opposition that was concentrated against the men landing on the beaches a mile to the west, the enemy fire on the centre of the landing beaches at Red 3 was nevertheless plenty heavy. 31 LVTs began hitting Red 3 at 0922. 2 found exits through the seawall near the base of the pier and continued onto the ground beyond. Not many of the Red 3 defenders had been killed by the naval bombardment, but many of those manning the beach fortifications were too dazed to react quickly. The Japanese had been astonished and demoralized to see Ringgold and Dashiell, the in-close fire support group, lay to a mere 2,000 yards offshore and keep the assault zone under furious 5-inch fire until the Marines landed. In some places, defenders were found convulsive, lying face down in dugouts and pillboxes, so incapacitated by the destroyer fire as to be helpless. These were bayoneted or dispatched with bullets to the head. The main reason for the success at Red 3 was blind luck. The landing, for the most part, was heavily concentrated and occurred largely on one half of the beach. Smoke and dust had obscured the landmarks, and heavy wire and concrete obstacles had channeled most of the LVTs to the left half of the sector, to a place where the beach was less heavily defended. To the men of Lieutenant Stacey Davis's 1st Platoon of Company F, the landing was a hot one. Private First Class Richard Spooner was aghast at the ferocity of fire we were pouring at the nips as his LVT headed for the island. Then it appeared as if our craft had been hit, which surprised me. I looked over toward Lieutenant Davis and almost went into shock. Half of his face looked as if it was shot off. "No, no," I pleaded. "This can't be." It didn't look as if he could possibly survive. Minutes later, the LVT took a direct hit and was blown up. Spooner found himself in water up to my chest, still trying to keep myself in one piece. Davis survived, and within minutes of reaching shore led an attack against the Burns-Philp wharf east of the pier, where he was wounded again before pulling back to the beachhead. One LVT after another caught Japanese attention. As the craft carrying Private Donald M. Libby of Donora, Pennsylvania, came in on the extreme right of the second wave, bullets came through the unarmored sides and he was wounded in both legs. An instant later, a mortar shell rocked the vehicle, and Libby was hurled bodily into the lagoon. When he came to, he looked himself over. His body was peppered with bullets and shrapnel, the larger fragments of which he pulled out himself. He clung to the wreckage of the LVT, which now lay on its side. For hours he waited for help. Finally, about noon, a Marine approached. "What state are you from?" the man yelled. Libby, by this time suffering from the onset of shock, realized that something was not right. The man's helmet appeared too large for his head, his rifle was slung across his back, and he carried a bayonet, with a blade shanked at the hilt. Libby rose weakly just as the Japanese, disguised in Marine fatigues, attacked. He slashed out with the bayonet, piercing Libby's left hand. The wounded American wrenched the weapon away with his right hand and clubbed the enemy to the reef. He held the man's head under the water until he drowned. Unwilling to risk further unwanted adventure, Libby began swimming back out into the lagoon. Many hours later, his uniform ripped and torn, his body scratched and bloody, he was fished out of the water by a passing LVT crew. The assault troops who hit the beach intact were elated, none more so than Major Crow. The 44-year-old redhead was already a Marine Corps legend. He had been an old-time enlisted man as late as 1940. The mustachioed officer, the only battalion commander to successfully land with the assault troops at Tarawa, had cajoled and connived to get this 8-hour assignment for his battalion. His first attempt had been turned down, but Crow had not given up. He argued his case on the grounds that his battalion had earned the right during the training in New Zealand. Colonel Shoup agreed and assigned the 2nd Battalion what everyone believed at the time was the toughest objective. Shoup's gamble paid off. Now behind the assault waves, a dozen LCVPS lowered their ramps on the reef, and reinforcements jumped into the water. Ahead lay 1,000 yards of gently shelved reef surmounted by the seawall and a belt of pillboxes and bunkers. Crow's journey to the island had been maddening. As his charging command boat drew abreast of the reef, Crow viewed the enemy fire pouring out at his men with a fearless intensity. It was known throughout the 8th Marines that he could hardly wait for the fighting to begin. As the 4th Wave landing boats headed into Red 3, they not only ran afoul of enemy machine guns, they also came under mortar fire. Men dived for cover behind ramps and gunnels. Not Crow, their commander. He remained standing on the foredeck. A Marine remembered, the boys all hunched low on the troop deck, all except Big Jim. He remained upright, staring angrily at the positions of the Japanese guns behind the beach. The man concluded then and there that Crow was likely the finest soldiering Marine I ever knew. Crow's LCVP ground to a halt 500 yards from shore, and its Navy coxswain hesitated. Nearby, another landing boat bottomed out, and the men watched it disintegrate under the impact of a direct hit by a large mortar round. Amid the roar of the diesel engines and the thunder on the reef, Crow shouted to the coxswain, "Now! For Christ's sake, drop the ramp!" Afraid of sinking, the sailor refused and prepared to turn his boat back toward the lagoon. Nothing the infuriated Crow said or did could persuade the coxswain to drop the ramp. Crow yelled over the crump of exploding mortar shells, cursing the sailor roundly, and ordered his group over the sides. As he plunged into water up to his shoulders, Crow could see bullets splashing in the water all around. He struck off abreast of his group for the shoreline. Smoke was building up behind the beach. When another man in the party, First Lieutenant Kenneth J. Fagan, saw the fantastic storm into which they were wading, he yelled out to his battalion leader, suggesting that they could all return to the transport for a coffee break if things did not work out. Crow burst out laughing and continued toward shore. As Crow and his men splashed through the surf, other men streamed past them, going the opposite way. Waist deep in the water, oblivious to the gunfire, Crow halted, and with a strange, maniacal look on his face, moved among their wavering ranks. He turned them around with the sheer force of his personality, and a menacing 12-gauge pump shotgun he waved in their faces, and ploughed on. He had been machine-gunned before, except that in the Solomons he had been in the jungle. As a captain at Guadalcanal, he had howled, "God damn it, you'll never get the Purple Heart lying in a foxhole. Let's go get 'em." He charged a Japanese trench and single-handedly knocked out a machine-gun emplacement. For this conspicuous action he had won a Silver Star and had been promoted on the spot to Major. Said a Marine combat correspondent of Crow, his men spoke about him reverently in subdued whispers, as one worthy of the highest respect of man and God. 50 yards from shore, men going down around him, Crow came across a crippled LVT. Its motor was running irregularly, and the driver was coaxing it shoreward in about 3 feet of water. Crow and several others veered toward the LVT, and, with machine-gun bullets whining all around, took cover behind it the rest of the way in. As the LVT drove up onto the beach, Crow suddenly pitched back into the water. The vehicle had run over a mine and exploded with terrific force. The men were knocked on their backs, cut and bruised, but otherwise unhurt. The LVT was destroyed. Crow was angry that it had taken him so long to reach shore, but was happy to have made it. Private First Class William Clear also found himself going in against heavy resistance. The fire was heavy as hell as we went in. I was scared to death. An 18-year-old Marine over on my right was not at all concerned. "Christ, Bill," he said, "ain't we giving those Japanese hell?" I didn't have the heart to tell him most of that stuff was going the other way. Crow landed at 0940 and radioed that his battalion was ashore, but encountering heavy opposition. There were casualties, but fewer than he had expected to see after his own experience getting ashore. Totaling his losses after the battle, Crow would report just 25 killed and wounded in landing. A swift move inland pushed the beachhead to the airfield in several places, widening the area forward of the water's edge to give the assault troops some breathing room. In 40 minutes, the Marines had established a 100-yard front between the lagoon and the Japanese defences back of the seawall. One by one, enemy strongpoints overlooking the lagoon fell, but overall little of Red 3 was in American hands. Although no firm contact would be established between the lead assault companies until late afternoon, and enemy small arms fire was still serious within the beachhead, the 2nd Battalion's assault landing was a triumphant success by the standards of Tarawa. Crow was personally committed to getting the attack moving. Ignoring the enemy gunfire, he paraded defiantly up and down the beach. Most men, such as Private First Class Spooner, were taken aback at the sight of this burly, straight-backed major with the booming voice who moved fearlessly among them, exhorting them to move out and to get off your asses and over that goddamn wall. While he was stomping about, 5 men around him were killed by snipers. Few dared to defy Crow's words or risk his wrath. Men could see that he clutched his swagger stick in one hand and his shotgun in the other. The effect was all the heroic battalion commander could have hoped for. "I wasn't about to try and swim away," recalled Private First Class Spooner. "I figured if I tried to, that old tiger would beat me to death with that cane of his." Even as Crow was moving among the frightened survivors of his battalion, reinforcements, guns, tanks and supplies were piling up at the reef. Chief Petty Officer Tadeo Unuki, the former country boy from Kasumigara, watched the assault landing operation through the observation slit of his navy grey and green camouflaged Type 97 light tank. He could see as far as the reef line through the smoke. He had studied the various approaches to the island for many months. He knew them well. There were sectors where the island was flat behind the beach, with the seawall running for hundreds of yards in either direction, east and west. In other sectors, such as the one behind Red 2 where he was, the beach was backed by a low, shallow crest behind the seawall halfway between the airfield revetments and the crescent-shaped cove that was Red 1. The tank was largely hull down, screened from the lagoon by scrub foliage and the cover of coconut trees along the edge of the airfield. Unuki had personally chosen this sector, partly because of its suitability for allowing a wide firing arc for his 37mm main gun and twin 7.7mm machine guns, but primarily because it was a point from which he could withdraw quickly if necessary. A strong mobile position was the most important single factor in such a defensive mission. The trails and paths among the pillboxes and bunkers would allow him to range along the perimeter of any beachhead the enemy might succeed in establishing. Unuki oriented himself, checking his line of sight. The long pier lay several hundred yards to his right, broken and burning furiously near its end where terrible fighting had raged. The northeastern point of the island, the Bird's Beak, was far to his left. A terrific wall of smoke blotted out the lagoon. The enemy assault troops had appeared from out of the unnatural haze and come in all the way to the beach aboard the dual-drive little boats with wheels. Now, however, the direct fire of dozens of pieces of heavy and medium artillery blocked the reef approaches to the enemy reinforcements who disembarked from untracked boats. The enemy reserves appeared as tiny toys sloshing forward through the water with their heavy packs and equipment, and Unuki was mesmerized by the spectacle. A ragged wave of tractors returned to the reef and commenced shuttling additional troops, with their heavy radios, machine guns and mortars, to the far shore. The battle was very different from what Unuki had imagined it would be during the anti-invasion exercises. There was an uncommon orderliness in the overall direction of the enemy movement, in the desperation of men hurrying to accomplish their crossing of the reef, with sudden violent death hounding them. The noise level, even now that the naval bombardment had lifted, was nothing short of apocalyptic. There appeared to have been little success to the landing in this sector. The beaches here were shallow, little more than sand strips, and blocked by the seawall. There were no easy points of exit for vehicles or men, and the Japanese artillery shot methodically at the boats on the reef. Despite the ferocity of the enemy bombardment and the devastation it had wrought, numerous guns had survived, and now their shells found their mark, shredding the green-clad figures, hurling them about in eruptions of white coral and brown water, and setting their ungainly vehicles ablaze in shattering fountains of flame. Unuki was astonished by the courage of the Americans. The blasts and smoke made it difficult to see, but Unuki soon made out a line of infantry crossing the reef on foot, and he opened fire with his machine guns. He poured short bursts of bullets into the advancing American ranks. Enemy troops fell everywhere, but it was impossible to determine whether the hits belonged to Unuki or some other Japanese gunner hidden in a bunker or entrenchment nearby. Beyond the pier, he saw enemy armor crawling ashore. To his left, another pair of tanks was making for the bird's beak. What, wondered Unuki, would happen if he engaged the tanks in a gun duel? As he contemplated the alternatives, he was relieved of the necessity to decide. Several hammering blows on the hull of the tank compelled him to look through the lower vision slit. Banging on the tank with his rifle was an exhausted Rigosentai. Unuki, the man said urgently, was to immediately move his tank back to the command post. With the unpleasant decision of whether to attack the American armor made for him, Unuki turned his own tank around and wasted no time in driving inland. Behind him, the American tanks came ashore. They took up positions and quickly began cracking open Japanese pillboxes with their 75mm guns. A firm grip on what was happening along the invasion front had so far eluded the 2nd Marines commanding officer, Colonel Shoup. He had been trying to track the operation's progress from an LCM circling off the reef. The command post of Lieutenant Colonel Amy's battalion was supposed to be in the center of Red 2, about 50 yards from the water's edge. Shoup was unaware that the indomitable Amy had been killed, since contact had been lost with the assault battalions. The area beneath the pier among the pilings was crowded with Marines heading in 2 directions. Some men were cautiously picking their way forward. Others, wounded, fearful of the Japanese resistance, were moving toward the reef, away from the island. The LVTs returning from the beach seemed in equally bad shape. Shoup's radio man broadcast hailings again and again, but to no avail. As the command boat circled, it was clear that conditions ashore must be terrible. Shoup was uneasy and worried. Shoup decided to commit his reserve. The situation seemed the worst on Red 1, so at 9:58 he ordered Major would-be Kyle's 1st Battalion 2nd Marines to land on Red 2 and work to the west, reduce the pocket from the flank, and link up with Major Shuttle's isolated and pinned-down remnants on Red 1. Shoup wanted desperately to know what he would find when he finally reached shore. Determined to get there, he and the 2nd Marines command staff boarded an outbound LVT that was transferring its wounded to their boat. Shoup decided to take a roundabout way which would bring him first to the sector of Red 3, lying east of the central pier, before he struck out for the 2nd Battalion command post somewhere near the center of Red 2. Though the detour would add almost 300 yards to his journey, Shoup had good reason for the diversion. Red 3 was apparently under less enemy fire than Red 2, but as his LVT navigated the boat passage along the eastern side of the pier, things changed. They met a terrific storm of fire, and one of the men in the craft was wounded. A few yards farther, the LVT was delayed. A Marine beneath the pier indicated that the enemy still controlled the base of the pier nearest Red 3, and that if Shoup landed there, he would be unable to reach Red 2. Shoup could see for himself that troops were retreating under the lee of the pier, and he was shocked. The situation was much worse than he had feared. It appeared that the entire assault was endangered. He could not believe that the Japanese defenders had recovered so quickly, or that so much of the front remained in enemy hands. It was also hard to accept that he had to turn back, as his staff was urging him to do. Shoup ordered the LVT driver to double back and again try the Red 2 side of the pier. They had rounded the pier head and gone about 200 yards down the western boat passage when a shell struck nearby and the LVT's engine stopped. The driver dived overboard. In the midst of airburst artillery fire, Shoup looked around and saw that further progress was hopeless. Several enlisted men in the craft were wounded. "Let's get out of here!" shouted Shoup. "Everybody out!" He led the staff over the side but hit the reef and badly wrenched his knee. Nevertheless, they worked their way toward the shelter of the pier, which they reached at 10:30. Here Shoup commandeered an LCVP he spotted navigating a narrow channel on the west side of the pier. He boarded the craft and ordered it toward shore. They were turned back by heavy fire. He commandeered another outbound LVT filled with casualties. Shoup jumped aboard and discovered that most of the casualties were dead. He ordered the crew to help him throw the bodies overboard and demanded of his staff, "All right, who's coming with me?" Only one man rose, Lieutenant Colonel Carlson, the former commander of the raid on Makin. Carlson, an observer of the 4th Marine Division, already had personally led 2 groups of Marines to shore and returned. Shoup shamed the rest of his staff into his waiting LVT. On the way to shore, he spotted groups of Marines huddling beneath the pier and behind wrecked landing craft. "Which of you idiots are coming with me?" he shouted. Some men reluctantly got up and started for shore. Shoup headed for the base of the pier, where it appeared that some of the 2nd Battalion had landed. It would be noon before he touched sand. Just as he hit the beach, a large shell landed with telling effect. 2 riflemen behind the group were killed in the blast, and in the concussion, Shoup fell to his knees. His horrified staff rushed to his aid, but he pushed them back. "Keep away!" he shouted angrily, battling back nausea and struggling to his feet without their help. Limping, he led them inland. About 15 yards from the water's edge, the command group found shelter behind a bunker in which 3 Japanese had been killed. The structure was 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 10 feet high. Here, in a hole in back of this fortification, Shoup established his headquarters. Shoup crawled into the hole, recalled correspondent William Hipple, and said, "Okay, let's get going. If we don't secure a piece of this island by nightfall, we're in a spot." His staff tried not to show unnecessary alarm at the sight of his torn and bloodied trousers. The stocky regimental commander had not only badly wrenched a knee, but in the explosion on the way in, he had taken a painful shotgun blast of shrapnel in the back of his legs. The determined colonel began to learn the truth about the invasion. Its centre ran along the beach and its indentations for a distance of about 250 yards, roughly from the pier now at his back to a point 200 yards east of the pocket. From Major Rice, the 2nd Battalion's executive officer, who had mislanded in the centre of Red One with a radio, it was confirmed that the western flank was a mess. On the Bird's Beak and elsewhere around the crescent-shaped cove of Red One were the leaderless and embattled survivors of Major Shuttle's shattered battalion. On the west were the companies of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Shoup could piece together very little information about the strength of any of these assault forces. In his own area, between the 2 other beachheads, the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was holding on precariously, but had been badly mauled. Other than the troops holding out around him, Shoup had little but the scant remains of ghost companies. Other groups, officers told him, were not concentrated, and there were units that still could not be accounted for. The bulk of his artillery was immobilized at the reef, sitting on the decks of landing craft near the pier head, which was still burning. A group of Sherman tanks and half-track, mounted 75mm guns, were supposed to have landed by now, but one of the tanks had sunk in deep water, and the rest had diverted to Red 3. The half-tracks had not even reached the reef. Thus, on Red 2 at this moment, Shoup had at best only about 600 men. Although reserves and any stragglers and splinter groups yet to land would presumably strengthen the forces in the centre of the front, at the moment Shoup had nowhere near the reinforced battalion he had expected. Neither he nor Carlson were overly optimistic of the outcome of the battle, but both men refused to give in to defeatism. They saw what many younger Green Marine officers did not, that what the 2nd Division lacked in veteran troops and experienced officers, it might still make up for with the grim dedication and fierce tradition that the Marine Corps imbued in its combat forces. But either way, it would be a close thing. The carnage among the assault troops at Tarawa had been awful. 2 battalion commanders, those of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines and the 2nd LVT Battalion, had been killed outright. A third, the CO of the 2nd Tank Battalion, lay critically wounded offshore atop a pile of dead Marines, his whereabouts unknown to anyone. A 4th Battalion commander was stranded offshore and out of contact with his troops. The assault commander, Colonel Shoup, had been wounded but was still in action. Owing to heavy casualties among leaders and tremendous disorganization, no company had landed with its officer and NCO cadre at full strength. Not more than 1,200 Marines, the remnants of a reinforced Marine amphibious assault regimental combat team, had landed by the time it had been planned. There would be 3,000 men over the seawall and fighting inland. The only positive thing that could be said was that elements of the 2nd Marine Division were ashore. Aboard the flagship at mid-Moming, the Navy and Marine High Command gathered in grim knots on the bridge. Over the unreliable radio net, they had been able to monitor only brief fragmentary reports of the battle. Excerpts from communications journals give an almost hour-by-hour account of the crisis at Tarawa up to the time troops began to dig in for the night. 910th. CO Red 3 reports heavy opposition. 912. Troops landing Red 2 meeting heavy resistance. 917. Boats held up on reef right flank of Red 1. Troops receiving heavy fire in the water. 11:05. 3rd Battalion is landing to rear of troops on Red 3 and catching hell. 12:03. Large caliber guns on west coast firing on boat waves. Request immediate air attack. 1345. Red 3 reserve team unable to land. Heavy enemy fire. Is there another beach where we can land? 1350. Anti-boat guns holding up reserves. Troops on Red 2 are 400 yards away from Japanese guns on the right. When word reached the flag that Shoup finally had arrived on the beach, Major General Julian Smith crossed the Bridge of Maryland and rushed over to Colonel Red Mike Edson, the hero of Guadalcanal. "They've done it!" exclaimed Smith, extending his hand to his icy calm chief of staff. Edson demurred. "I'd rather wait, sir," he said. The incredible view from the cockpit filled Navy Lieutenant Commander Robert McPherson with a sense of personal grief. The sight through the plexiglass window of his Kingfisher spotting plane brought the veteran air observer deep sorrow. Below him were wave upon wave of amphibious vehicles, landing craft and support units creeping forward. Behind them dozens of artillery pieces and armoured vehicles were hung up in barges on the reef, and still more waves were circling or forming up in the lagoon. McPherson flew along the reef line, flying low, revealing the big white star on the underside of the wings of the diminutive naval aircraft. Quite simply, the Navy commander, whose job it was to report the progress of the assault waves and call in naval gunfire from Maryland, was humbled and awed by the enormity of the horror occurring below him. He watched as the Marines and their machines flowed toward the island like a ragged parade, each of them part of a process far greater than the nightmare that surrounded each individual. In all respects, it was alarming. Some assault waves were at a standstill. The hulks of Navy landing craft were burning where the enemy's artillery had stopped them. Here and there, the protection afforded by these wrecked or burning vehicles and the pier sheltered small knots of men. So confused and frightened were they that one could in places hear their curses and prayers above the din of battle. Fantastically horrid vistas spread before the ranging spotter's plane. McPherson had swept low and scanned the exposed coral reef since before H-hour, and it now appeared to him that the battle had become a monumental mess on the verge of collapse. In the planning, the Navy staff had anticipated little trouble in getting ashore. Yet from the sky, from his bird's-eye view, it was obvious to McPherson that only the first 3 assault waves had moved well. Of the 100 LVTs that had loaded in the transport area, perhaps 3/4 actually crossed the reef as planned. Despite the intense enemy fire, the bravery of the LVT crews had carried the spearhead of the 2nd Division ashore. But for every 6 or 7 LVTs that had rushed toward land along orderly parallel routes in the right general direction, 3 or 4 sooner or later had gone off diagonally toward wrong sectors, or had been sunk at sea or knocked out. McPherson could see that the battalion on Red 3 had already pushed its lead elements across the seawall and inland in the west, even as desperate fighting just across the reef had been occurring in the other 2 battalion landing zones. The Japanese capacity to strike back at the tide of assault troops moving toward shore had proved remarkably heavy. McPherson could only guess about the fearful casualties that already must have been suffered. Long after H-hour, by which time it should have been knocked out, enormous fire continued to pour forth from the huge concrete bomb-proof shelter blocking the way of Major Crow's assault troops on Red 3. Over the naval air observation net, McPherson pleaded for naval gunfire to take out the deadly position. "Can't something be done about that enemy blockhouse?" he radioed frantically. A dispassionate voice responded affirmatively, but no naval gunfire fell near the strong point. The water seemed never clear of tiny men, their rifles held over their heads, slowly wading beachward, noted McPherson. I wanted to cry. These were hours of anguish. Marines scrambled to the shelter of the coconut log seawall and lay there, exhausted and scared out of their wits. The battle was only a few hours old, yet already events were like nothing anyone had dreamed in their worst nightmares. It was, a Marine later said, like fighting in the middle of a pool table without any pockets. Men crawled forward over the seawall in 1s and 2s, and began to work in among the pillboxes and bunkers, assaulting some and avoiding others. Overhead, the equatorial sun was getting hotter, and all along the Tarawa invasion beaches, Japanese artillery shells and machine gun and small arms fire were registering horribly well. By 10:30, Major Kyle, a Guadalcanal veteran, had commandeered enough LVTs to begin landing 2 companies of his 1st Battalion 2nd Marines. He had been flagging down the precious vehicles since 1000 as they returned from the 8-hour landing waves to the edge of the reef. As his fresh formation arrived at the reef, they had been shocked to learn that the water was too shallow to float their LCVPS. When they had been ordered to leave the line of departure, no one had told them about the condition of the reef. Soon the confusion began. Boats began piling up in a terrible, confused traffic jam. During the process of moving men from their bobbing boats to LVTs, Japanese fire had continued heavily throughout the lagoon. 3 of the ramp boats were sunk by direct hits during the transfer phase. During it all, the Marines revealed a courageous, if curious, eagerness to get into the fight. The LVTs turned and started back to Red 2 with these reinforcements as quickly as they could be loaded, without waiting to form into organized waves. The first vehicle reached the beach without trouble. The Japanese were still concentrating for the most part against the Marines already ashore. The second LVT, coming in several minutes later, did not fare so well. At least 2 machine guns and possibly 3 shifted their fire from the Marines pinned down on the beach to the LVT just as it ground to a halt behind the seawall to debark troops. Marines scrambled out of the craft from all sides under converging streams of machine gun fire. 2 squads, about 20 men, were wiped out, every man falling dead or wounded. The rest of the 2 companies encountered the same intense fire that had riddled the assault troops earlier. Before 1100, most of the LVTs were knocked out by hits from large-caliber shells and raked with machine gun fire. The vehicles on the right were forced off course and driven toward Red 1, where a total of 115 men would miss land and attach themselves to understrength units of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. Marines forced to wade in were cut down in sweeping rows along the reef. In all, not more than 400 men of Kyle's group reached shore as planned. The LVTs, ranging in number from 1 to 8, would continue to attempt the journey throughout the day, with heavy loss of life. Colonel Shoup's first attempt at rapid reinforcement of the beachhead had failed ignominiously, battered to pieces by overwhelming Japanese opposition. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, under Major Robert H. Rood, arrived off the reef for the reinforcement of Red 3. They had been ordered forward at 10:18 and crossed the line of departure at 1100. Like those units before it, this battalion also was unable to cross the reef in LCVPs. As the boat waves approached, they came under rapid 20mm and 40mm fire. They were still closing the reef when, wham! A thunderous crack near the tail end of the island was heard. Marines ashore, stunned, moved instinctively closer to the protection of the seawall. Almost immediately, the roar of the battle faded momentarily. Behind them, a strange sound, like the noise of a steel girder hitting concrete, said United Press correspondent Richard Johnston, reverberated across the lagoon. The noise, recalled Johnston, pierced the ears, above the howling fury of the battle, and echoed for seconds. Out in the blue water, the westernmost Higgins boat disappeared, quite literally. It had been there, and suddenly it was not. In its place, for a split second, there was a blur in the air, and then there was nothing. What had happened was all too clear. The crew of a Japanese 5-inch coastal artillery piece had spotted the 6 waves of reinforcements and opened fire. Within the span of a minute, 2 landing craft disappeared in blinding flashes before rapid counter-battery fire from Ringgold silenced the powerful enemy gun. The Japanese shelling, said Johnston, was a terrifying and heartbreaking sight. The coxswains of the other craft immediately stopped. Shouted one terrified sailor, "This is as far as I go!" The ramp was dropped, and 20 Marines jumped off into water 10 to 15 feet deep, all but 1 or 2 drowned. In another LCVP, a Marine platoon leader panicked and ordered the ramp lowered against the counsel of the crew. One of the first men off, a private, weighed down by 2 heavy ammunition chests strapped to his shoulders, disappeared the instant he hit the water. Other boats, their crews killed, wounded, or missing, drifted out of control. Some men were picked up by rescue boats, others would float around for hours before being picked up. but a startling number of men, with messmates trying to close their minds to the screams, were pulled under by their battle burdens and drowned. They died just yards, often feet, from the coral reef, killed even before they were in the fight. Lieutenant Paul S. Hospodar of Lorain, Ohio, was in the midst of the fury. The story of his first machine gun platoon, Company 1, is typical of what occurred in the first attempt to reinforce Red 3. The platoon was loaded into 2 LCVPs and 2 LCMs in the 4th wave. We circled about, awaiting further orders, he noted, and finally proceeded to make a 4 abreast landing on the northeast side of the pier under intense enemy fire. Scattered mortar shells fell around them during their approach to the reef. At 1,000 yards, they began to receive artillery and heavy machine gun fire. Boat number 4, an LCVP, was hit dead-on and began to sink. Sergeant Kenneth W. Seymour of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and 16 others abandoned the doomed craft. They worked their way to the burning pier, and during the journey to shore killed several enemy snipers hidden among the pilings. Along the way, 5 men were killed or wounded. The survivors were the lucky ones. The other 3 boats ploughed to within 800 yards of the shore, where a mortar shell exploded on the deck of boat number 3, another LCVP. Exactly what happened to the men and material in this landing craft was never determined. No one was able to say for certain, but it was believed that about a half-dozen men were lost in the shattering mortar blast. Others drowned, claimed by the sea after scrambling into the deep water to escape the sinking LCVP. That left about 10 men who struck out for shore. Perhaps 5 made it, but were soon killed. The other 2 boats, both LCMS, grounded unscathed in the same area and dropped their ramps. From boat number 1, all hands jumped into water over their heads. At least 1 man drowned, doomed by the heavy weight of equipment he carried. The same thing happened to the Marines in boat number 2. 25 men jumped out before they realized that the water was too deep. 5 were dragged back aboard before the ramp was raised, and the boat backed off under heavy fire. The remainder of the men were left clinging to debris or to the wrecks of other destroyed landing craft in pathetic attempts to stay afloat. Some succeeded in reaching the end of the pier, at least 1 drowned. Before any of the platoon reached shore, 3/4 of the men were lost to enemy fire, drowning, or inability to disembark. The unit had practically ceased to exist before it even fired a shot. It was all over by 11:45. Mortars, machine guns, and anti-boat fire had inflicted heavy casualties and completely disorganized the battalion. Hospodar's boats were so badly butchered that Rood withdrew the rest of the beleaguered landing waves. It would be late afternoon before what remained of the battalion could take an effective part in the battle. Survivors would continue to show up after nightfall. In everything that has been written about Tarawa, less attention has been paid to the travails of such reserve battalions as 1, 2, and 38 than to units that landed at H-hour. Not by any stretch of the imagination, however, was the worst hostile fire limited to the H-hour waves. In fact, even before the first wave had jumped into the chest-deep water, Rood's battalion had suffered severe casualties. Of the first wave, only 30% reached shore. Of the second, 20%. The third wave was, according to Rood, completely wiped out. In fact, they were pulverized before they got ashore, said PFC Rick Spooner, who had been watching from the beach. Those poor guys were dropping in bunches. Only 1 out of 3 of these men made it ashore. The survivors moved off toward the central pier to make their way to the beach under its cover. By mid-afternoon of D-Day, 5 reinforced battalions of Marines had been committed at Tarawa. All but 1 had suffered crippling casualties and were in bad shape. On Red 1, the disorganized elements of 3 battalions were practically fighting an independent action. On Red, 2 elements of 2 battalions struggled to hold on where they had landed. Little headway was made in the attempts to clear out the positions from which fire was being directed against the narrow 200-yard front. On Red, 3 elements of 2 battalions held a front of 250 yards and a beachhead about 100 yards deep. Their major effort was under Major William C. Chamberlain of Seattle. He had been a professor of economics at Northwestern University when the war began. Though wounded, he directed the attack toward the heavily defended area of Burns-Philp Wharf. Within 6 hours, the matter of greatest concern had become not how quickly the Japanese could be crushed, but rather the fate of the 5 battalions on the narrow beaches of the island. With their backs to the lagoon, The Marines were manning essentially two disjointed beachheads in the area of the bird's head and along the outline of its belly. These were small toeholds, really, and the Marines had little armor support and no artillery except for the two destroyers in the lagoon. If the 5 battalions were attacked in strength at any point along the coast, the situation could become perilous. Optimism was a rare commodity at this time. The American High Command had thrown all the naval and military might at its disposal against this vitally strategic objective, yet the walls of Fortress Tarawa barely had been scratched. Now the question had become, could the Marines hold on? Julian Smith radioed Major. General Holland Smith, the crusty, pugnacious commander of the V Amphibious Corps, aboard the 5th Amphibious Force flagship Pennsylvania off Makin, to brief him on the situation as it was then known and request release of the Corps Reserve, the 6th Marines, to 2nd Division control. The issue, reported Julian Smith in all seriousness, is in doubt. Aboard Indianapolis, the Commander-in-Chief, Central Pacific, Rear Admiral Spruance, conferred with the Chief of 5th Fleet Operations, Captain Emmett P. Savvy Forrestal, about the shocking issue in doubt message sent to V Amphibious Corps headquarters at Makin. The highly regarded former destroyer man had hurried to the bridge with the message to see firsthand what Spruance thought of it. Looking across the lagoon, Forrestal was flabbergasted at the sight of the vast disaster developing. Boats circled offshore in the lagoon in milling confusion. It was impossible to determine if the Marines were winning. All morning, Forrestal had monitored reports of Marines moving along the exposed reef and Burnsfilp Pier and being cut to pieces. He feared that reinforcements and supplies would never reach shore, and that it was only a matter of time before the small assault force would be overpowered. If the 2nd Division was to continue fighting as an effective combat unit, Forrestal insisted, the plight of the understrength assault forces had to be eased. Forrestal urged the 5th Fleet commander to inform CINCPAC of the deteriorating situation. The Chief of Operations and others of the 5th Fleet staff strongly believed that their big picture view of the battle was sharper and broader than those of the men actually directing the desperate fighting. This, given the awful chaos and confusion, led to a heightened sense of serious crisis. They urged Spruance to send messages to Rear Admiral Hill and Major General Julian Smith to affirm the urgent requests for men, armor, vehicles, air support, and guns that must be satisfied. Finally, ComSemPAC himself should intervene, Forrestal told his boss. Spruance, however, refused. "I pick men who I believe are competent to do the job," the soft-spoken victor of Midway said, "and I'm going to let them do it." He stood wordlessly, watching through binoculars when there was something to see, calmly waiting when there was not. At Makin, Major General Holland Smith, commander of the V Amphibious Corps, was pacing near the radio shack aboard Pennsylvania, observing in his opinion the dilatory Makin operation, when the alarming message from his friend Julian Smith came in. He rushed to the Admiral's quarters, where the irascible, terrible Turner was catching his first rest in nearly 48 hours. Smith personally woke him, and the two ill-tempered commanders conferred privately for 30 minutes. The fight for Makin, though infuriatingly slow, and one that Howlin' Mad Smith believed Marines would have finished in a few hours, was going well, and it appeared to be only a matter of time before the army overran the island. Turner told Smith to do what he thought was best under the circumstances, and went back to sleep. The Marine General approved the request to commit the 6th Marines to action at Tarawa, but he was sorely worried. The battle was only a few hours old. Howlin' Mad counselled himself and the naval and marine staff on the bridge to the effect that Julian Smith would not have asked me to commit our last reserve unless conditions demanded this desperate action. Chief Petty Officer Unuki had never encountered a more frustrating time. As the commander of perhaps one of only 2 surviving Japanese tanks, a staff officer explained, it now was Unuki's job to conduct combat reconnaissance. He was to determine the locale of friendly forces, probe the enemy front and locate, if possible, any gaps or weaknesses, and then report back to the command post. Unuki was to be the Admiral's eyes, he was told. Yet he ran into problems from the beginning. In the chaos at the command post, he lost his crew. He had no idea where they had gone or what had happened to them. They should have been waiting for him at the entrance to the bunker. Unuki was in a fix. Obviously, his comrades had become separated from him in the confusion surrounding the huge headquarters complex, which now was under infantry and naval gunfire from the enemy's forward assault elements, and was crowded by the hundreds of wounded who sought shelter behind its thick walls. Unuki had no tank operating capability without a crew. A scratch team was put together. Among them was the wounded commander of another tank whose vehicle had been lost during the pre-landing naval bombardment. The fire flash of a near miss had burned out the tank and scorched the crew, who were friends of Unuki's. An untrained seaman also bravely volunteered. Unuki assigned him to the main gun. The CPO got into the driver's compartment and, after a jerking start, edged the tank slowly toward the airfield. Together in the belly of the 7.5-ton tank, they moved out down the main runway. Under the best of conditions, the Type 97 light tank proved a tough, if under-armoured and sometimes unreliable, little combat package. It was certainly the Japanese tank most frequently encountered by the Allies during the war. But here, attempting to work around shell craters, its engine malfunctioning in the heat and dust, its ammunition nearly depleted, and without the covering fire of accompanying infantry, it was nearly helpless. Unuki could only hope for the best. Time weighed more heavily on his mind than it ever had before. The crew feared that they would be caught by an enemy plane or AT gun while moving so conspicuously down the runway. The volunteer gunner reported American infantry rushing across the airfield farther ahead and rapidly opened fire with a series of 37mm shells. The other crewman, the former tank commander, manned the machine guns, firing short bursts at the enemy column. Unuki realized that he could carry out his essential mission only as long as he kept the tank running and under control. They lost sight of the American troops. Unuki was spurring the tank on, pushing it as far as it could go when it broke down. Eminently conscious of their vulnerable situation, the crew continued firing as Unuki tried to nurse the engine back to life. He was about to order the tank abandoned when oddly the engine sputtered back into action. Although the clutch was burned out and the tank was stuck in low gear, Unuki was able to turn the tank around and return to the command post. There he waited into the afternoon as important papers were burned, wounded were moved, and dispositions for relocating the command post to the southern shore were made among the 300 men crowding the huge shelter. Unuki received new orders. He would help create a diversion for Rear Admiral Shibasaki's movement and interfere with American countermoves once the dash toward the ocean began. Sometime before Unuki struck out, a Navy captain demanded the attention of all who were crowded in the shelter. By some miracle, Shibasaki had succeeded in maintaining contact with Tokyo. The Navy captain held aloft a communications blank and announced that Shibasaki had received a message from His Majesty, Emperor Hirohito. The Americans were getting very close now. However, the vast facility grew quiet, and men stood rigidly out of respect for their figurehead monarch. "You have all fought gallantly," the officer read loudly so that everyone in the bunker could hear. "May you continue to fight to the death. Banzai." For the second time, Unuki was compelled to recruit yet another scratch crew. In the chaos, the other men had vanished. Unuki had last seen the former tank commander who had gone out with him on the brief reconnaissance when the latter returned to the shelter after a daring personal foray into the battle. "I've just killed a dozen Americans," the man shouted, wielding a bloody samurai sword. "I'm going back out to kill more. Who will come with me?" Several defenders followed the wild man back outside. Unuki never saw any of them again. Now he improvised once more, enlisting 2 others who climbed into the unreliable tank with him and departed the headquarters. They had fired off the last of their ammunition when the engine broke down again, this time for good. Again they were clearly visible in the open. The recruits escaped and took off. Unuki rigged the tank to burn, then dismounted. But before he could toss in a grenade to ignite the fuel, he was in the midst of heavy shelling. The body of a man, whether Japanese or American he did not know, landed nearby with a sickening thud, as if it had been dropped from a great height. Unuki, now alone, ran for cover. Tumbling into a crater, he found it filled to capacity with dead men. He stumbled on into a second shelter, a first aid post, and into a new nightmare. The bunker was small and crowded with dead and dying men. The dismounted tanker counted 6 occupants, among them 2 dead men, jammed so close together that it was difficult to move about. He recognized 2 defenders. Ironically, they were friends. the badly burned crewman from the tank whose commander had gone scouting with Unuki and was last seen brandishing a bloody sword. For a while there was a lull, but Unuki soon suspected that it was only a matter of time before they were all killed. The shelter was hit from all sides by machine gun, mortar and rifle fire, and was surrounded. It was hot and dark in the cramped quarters, and the men were hungry and thirsty. They clawed at the ground with their fingers until a puddle of brackish water formed, and they were able to drink from it. Unuki passed around a vitamin syringe, and each of them squeezed a drop through dry, cracked lips and onto their tongues. As the Americans assaulted the area around the shelter, the desperate, wounded tank crewmen sat and listened. The firing outside swept over them. Suddenly, one of the men recognized a new danger and yelled, "Grenades!" In a small ventilation shaft in the roof over their heads, they heard a scraping noise followed by a metallic clunk. They stuffed a blanket into the air shaft, which muffled the explosion. Now the only thing they could do was wait. The only means of escape from the bunker was through the narrow entrance beyond which the Americans continued to blaze away with machine guns and rifles, and, infinitely more harrowing, their awful flamethrowers. Everyone was beginning to succumb to the heat and stench of the indescribably foul air in the shelter. They began to collapse from exhaustion. Unuki leaned back against a sandbag wall, his knees buckled, and he slid down in a partly upright position. His strength and his capacity to resist were utterly spent. Suddenly the sanctuary of the bunker was no more. A frightful commotion occurred as the terrifying whoosh of a flamethrower swept the interior of the shelter. The brilliant orange fire filled the constricted space, and Unuki lost consciousness amidst a roaring hell of flame and shrieking screams. The issue was indeed in doubt for the American Navy and Marine commanders aboard the ships of the Southern Attack Force off Tarawa. With the spearhead of the 2nd Division now severely blunted, the problem of how to hold on and what could be done was causing increased tension and anxiety. Junior officers and NCOs in each sector, as soon as they had taken stock of their much-depleted ranks of assault troops, were frantically calling for more reinforcements in order to maintain their shallow footholds. Logistics and gunnery officers aboard the transports and cargo ships and warships were beset by an incomprehensible babble of conflicting requests for supplies and equipment and naval gunfire and air support. "A disaster is developing," repeated Savvy Forrestal, the 5th Fleet Operations Staff Officer, to Admiral Spruance aboard Indianapolis. Up to this point, Spruance, although aware that everything was not going according to plan, failed to see any reason or practical opportunity to intervene. The absence of water over the reef and the chaos and confusion that gripped the command structure left him uncertain whether he even had any positive contribution to make at this time. He had not been intimately focused on the attack on Tarawa since he had proposed it as the first American objective in the Central Pacific campaign. Rather, he had concentrated on the possibility of a general naval engagement northeast or west of the Gilberts, not to take place until the combined fleet had revealed itself. After further anxious consultation aboard the flagship, and against the advice of his staff, Spruance reaffirmed his decision not to interfere. He instructed his advisers to let Hill and his people work it out. Meanwhile, at Makin, the last major phase of the epic Galvanic assault was underway. The Sentinel Island of Kotabu had been seized without difficulty by a combined force of Army and Marine scouts, and now along the lagoon beaches of Butaritari the rest of March. General Ralph Smith's 27th Infantry Division assault troops were going ashore. There was unusual levity among the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 165th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Column John F. McDonough. As the first wave drew abreast of the destroyers Phelps and McDonough and headed for Yellow Beach 1 and Yellow Beach 2, some men were actually singing. Watching them pass, a warrant officer aboard Phelps wondered what kind of hell it was into which they were hurrying. Captain J.M. Baker recalled, "Some of the men read magazines. Although there was singing all along the line of landing craft, a few men fell asleep. Others were eating cold lunches and horsing around all the way in." Ahead of them, Baker observed that the smoke from exploding fuel dumps a mile or so apart was rolling over the treetops thousands of feet west of each fire. The low swells that backed up into the lagoon from the ocean to the west were spilled into choppy little waves by the breeze that knocked the top off a few of them. As they encountered the reef, they were met by machine gun and rifle fire about 500 yards from the beach. The bullets were dropping all around them and the boats of the succeeding waves, said Colonel MacDonough. With naval gunfire, exploding ammunition and fuel dumps on the shore, planes strafing and bombing the beach, the LVTs firing their rockets and machine guns, and the LCMs conveying the medium tanks right on the tails of the LVTs firing their machine guns, it was almost impossible for anyone to certify just where the enemy fire was coming from. The soldiers crouched low in their LVTs during the last 300 yards to shore. The first landing was at 10:41. Of the 16 LVTs carrying the assault troops into the Yellow Beaches, 2 were destroyed, 2 were wrecked, and 4 were damaged but reached the beach. On the right, 1 went out of control and careened across the island toward the ocean through the enemy's main fortified zone. It finally plunged into a crater. Before everyone could find cover, 2 of its occupants were killed by machine gun fire. 2 other LVTs were hit by enemy shells. Among the men who were caught dismounting, 5 were killed and a dozen wounded. To the left, one of the tracked landing craft ran up the seaplane ramp on King's Wharf, machine guns blazing. The soldiers leapt out and seized the pier by crawling along the slope of the causeway, which shielded them from enemy fire. Unable to return the fire, the Japanese fled. All of the other LVTs landed as planned and moved inland, swerving to the left or right before disembarking assault troops. As the assault troops touched down on Yellow 1 and Yellow 2, M3 Lee medium tanks of Company A, 193D Tank Battalion, 15 of them commanded by Captain Robert S. Brown, plunged off their landing craft into the water 150 to 200 yards offshore. All along the Yellow assault sectors, for almost 2,000 yards from the village of Butaritari near the stone pier to the west tank trap, the Lees clanked towards shore. Captain Brown could see smoke sweeping across the beach ahead, and the action around King's and Onchong's wharfs flanking either end of Yellow 1. As the tanks floundered toward the island, 2 were lost in shell holes. Captain Brown was in one of them. The sergeant commanding the other foundered tank recalled, "We went forward about 25 yards and hit a shell hole. We got out of that and went about 15 yards more and hit another. The water was about 7 feet deep, and our tank drowned out and immediately filled with smoke. My driver said the tank was on fire. The crew dismounted right there with great speed through the sponson door. I remained inside. As soon as the crew got out, they were machine-gunned from the shore, and with more speed they came back inside. Something like an hour and a half later, we were picked up. For most men of the 2nd Battalion landing behind the tanks, wading in over the reef in water 2 to 6 feet deep proved to be the toughest part of the battle for Makin. Once they were dumped into the water and surged forward, the hesitant troops found only spotty enemy opposition along the lagoon beaches. Nevertheless, they did not all charge off the boats. A few had to be coaxed to go ashore, and when they were in the water, they had to be told what to do. In some craft, grounding on the reef north of Butaritari, no one moved when the bow ramps were dropped. Officers yelled at them to get off, warning that while they remained in the boats, they were sitting ducks for Japanese artillery. "Get out!" they shouted in effect. "Do you want to be killed here? Move to the beach and get inland." As squad leaders leapt into the water, a soldier would follow, and then another. Finally, all would follow in a bunch. "Get inland! Keep moving!" officers shouted above the din of battle. Struggling over the reef in undisciplined knots, a few soldiers were caught by snipers or a machine gun that fired from Butaritari village. The officers and NCOs weaved back and forth among the ranks, separating groups of men, getting them to disperse. The soldiers moved in knots as many Marines did at Tarawa, seeking the deceptive safety they instinctively believed could be found in numbers. No enemy shells fell, but several men went down here and there from small arms fire. None drowned, but 2 were killed by gunfire. The worst was still to come, and it would decide the fate of this component of Galvanic. Some of the enemy fire came from a pair of battered derelict hulks, partially sunk off the end of Onchong's wharf. Ensign Andrew P. McConnell mounted 3 machine guns to starboard on his LCVP and manoeuvred into position so that all the guns could fire at once at the hulks. The Japanese fired back, and hard. From shore, men watched in admiration and amazement as the sailors, bullets flying all about the boat, directed a rain of lead against the enemy wreckage at close range. The firing continued until one of the guns jammed, and the crossfire from shore compelled the crew to withdraw. One seaman aboard the LCVP was seriously wounded in the action and later died. For the next 2 hours, all scheduled activity ashore and in the lagoon ceased while carrier planes bombed and strafed the hulks. At the same time, the destroyer Dewey slammed 5-inch shells at the wrecks. Other strong pockets of resistance were encountered. From one dugout, a Japanese officer emerged and approached Lieutenant John Campbell of M Company as if to surrender. However, at the last second, the Japanese struck out with his sword, and before he was shot down, Campbell was severely wounded. Once across Yellow 2, men of the 105th Infantry fought through several pillboxes and trenches and fortified redoubts before breaking through and driving inland. Behind them were 55 enemy dead and captured. In one elevated trench, which a platoon had overrun and now sought cover in, 2 large enemy groups emerged from connecting tunnels and fell upon the unsuspecting and outnumbered Americans in a vicious hand-to-hand melee. Before the Japanese were driven off, and the position mopped up with the help of an artillery barrage, 8 soldiers lay dead or wounded. More than 30 enemy bluejackets were killed. Despite such incidents of furious opposition, all resistance within the beachhead area was mopped up within 4 hours. Often it was accomplished with help. The 11 lees that reached the ocean shore of the island split up and moved east and west against the tank barriers, overrunning numerous enemy positions. One tank crushed a shelter as infantry stood by and gunned down a dozen Japanese who rushed out. Another wiped out a machine gun nest en route to the east. One tank drove directly into the village of Butaritari and without much difficulty destroyed several machine gun nests and pillboxes, using its 37mm turret gun and hull-mounted 75mm howitzer. Meanwhile, on the hammerhead end of the island 2 miles to the right of the citadel, things were curiously quiet. The assault troops on Yellow 1 had moved off the beach, avoided enemy contact, slanted southwest, and set out to link up with the assault force from the red sectors. They expected to meet by noon, but this was not to be. Unlike the 2nd Battalion, which had landed and advanced quickly, the 1st Battalion had been held up by the few Japanese defenders entrenched on the western half of the island. After advancing slowly against desultory opposition, the 1st Battalion momentum had stopped cold when it came up against the island-wide obstacle of the western tank barrier. The terrain also delayed the advance. Tangled undergrowth and swamps on either side of the only road led to confusion and extreme caution among the troops. Worse, the naval and air bombardment had badly cratered the road. The huge, mud-filled shell holes were more effective than any enemy barricade in holding up vehicles, and the soldiers were reluctant to go forward without their tanks. When they were able to advance, the Stuart light tanks of this force clattered forward nose to tail along the lagoon beach on the narrow coastal road to the west. After encountering little resistance for more than a mile, just 150 yards short of the tank trap, the battalion of the 165th Infantry came under heavy fire. Several men were hit, and the march petered out, the soldiers going to ground for cover. The delays, coupled with the poor condition of the red beaches, already were so critical that Rear Admiral Turner diverted follow-up forces to the lagoon beaches. The confusion became even worse. But even now at least one man in the chaos of Makin was acting. Along the lagoon beach, a confident colonel, Gardner J. Conroy, the 165th Infantry's defiant commanding officer, a prominent Manhattan lawyer in peacetime, walked up to the crews of the tanks and the assault troops, yelling at them to get a move on and silence the enemy strongpoints ahead. Along the beach, behind felled coconut trees and in the coarse undergrowth, exhausted and drained soldiers lay shoulder to shoulder, all along the line of advance, unprepared to move against the enemy fire. The intrepid Conroy rallied the troops and, showing the way, led the tankers up the road, oblivious to the rifle and machine gun fire that raked the area. Here and there, others were roused and came to life. Word came to bypass the Japanese strongpoint rather than launch a direct assault on it. Second Lieutenant Daniel T. Nunnery, a platoon leader and his company commander, went up through the undergrowth to a large coconut tree to reconnoitre a way around, and spotted the machine gun nest. As Nunnery considered the tactical problem, one of the Japanese riflemen saw him and cut loose. Nunnery was killed instantly, shot through the head. Nearby, a chaplain rushed to aid a wounded point man, and was himself wounded. Another soldier who gallantly dashed from cover to help them was killed. Colonel Conroy came upon the scene, leading 4 light tanks. He was walking upright. "Get down!" shouted a battalion commander. Conroy hesitated and was struck dead by a hail of bullets. From the moment he had landed on Red 1, Conroy had been setting an example, practically booting men forward. For all the daring and dash with which Conroy had urged his beloved but inexperienced 165th Infantry into action, its forward movement had been pushed home without determination or conviction. What momentum the heroic colonel had sparked simply evaporated upon his death. In fact, until 800 the next day, with the enemy long gone as the battle moved far ahead of this area, Conroy's lifeless form lay by the road. This was the pattern at Makin, where command now fell to Lieutenant Colonel Kelly. When the advance stopped for the night, the 27th Division assault troops were inland of their beachheads but woefully short of their objectives. The link-up had been achieved, but the forces were partially separated by an enemy pocket blocking the western approach to the citadel. D-Day losses were about 100 casualties, perhaps 1/4 of whom were killed. Rough fighting lay ahead in the next days, but for now the 27th Division commanders were pleased to be ashore. By evening, possibly 5,000 troops and 100 vehicles and guns had landed. The last significant action at Tarawa on D-Day was the drive by the combat group composed chiefly of survivors of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, commanded by the aggressive Major, Michael Ryan. Had Colonel Shoup but known, the difficulties on Jordan and Crow's beaches were somewhat offset by the success on the western end of the island, the personal triumph of Ryan, who played the important role in the accomplishment. This decisive, intensely determined Marine again demonstrated the outstanding qualities that would earn him a Navy Cross and a British Distinguished Service Order for his part in the battle. Even as Ryan and the Marines began their advance out of Red 1, the 2 surviving Shermans of Lieutenant Bale's tank platoon began driving right up to enemy bunkers, ramming their way through obstacles. The tanks, leading the advance, came so close to enemy positions that they ran the risk of being isolated, but at point-blank range, they knocked out Japanese strongpoints all along the rear of Green Beach. Behind the armoured support and under covering rifle fire, assault engineers began the demolition job of blowing up bunkers and pillboxes with fused TNT charges. This force drove ruthlessly toward the south shore of Betio across open ground, driving headlong into the flank of the main Japanese fortifications. The troops did not stop until they had come to within 300 yards of the sea. Reports of their dramatic gains, however, failed to reach either the flagship Maryland or Colonel Shoup. For this reason, the improving situation on Red 1 was not realized beyond Ryan's makeshift command group. While fighting was raging behind Green Beach, the rest of Ryan's group was struggling to hold on farther east. On the left half of Red 1, a mixed team of assault troops from 3 battalions fought a desperate action against the pocket and the fortifications inland dominating the junction with Red 2. Wherever the Americans advanced, Japanese defenders fought with all their customary ferocity to resist withdrawal. A single Type 97 light tank cut through a Marine platoon, and a fierce counterattack was forestalled only after naval gunfire was called in and aircraft were vectored to the scene. In some instances, Marines came across bunkers whose occupants had committed suicide rather than fight. But overall, there was little sign of demoralization among the enemy at this time. Ryan's command post was charged by several sword-swinging Japanese who were cut down by rifle fire in their mad rush. Lieutenant Bale in China Gal was out front with another Sherman, clearly visible in the open, crawling forward at walking speed to allow the Marines to keep up with them, when a storm of Japanese artillery and mortar shells fell around the clearing. There was a pause, and Bale was shocked to find no sign of the Marine infantry who had been covering the tanks. He suddenly knew why. As a solitary Japanese tank raced headlong toward him, its gun already beginning to traverse to meet the Sherman. The heat in China Gal was oppressive. Bale rushed to turn and set up a shot, but the enemy was upon him too quickly. The American fired first, and missed. The Japanese tank commander did not hesitate. He fired and hit. The enemy 37mm shell struck the Sherman's turret and disabled its traverse mechanism. Unable to fire again, Bale charged China Gal forward and rammed the enemy tank. He then roared hastily backward, leaving the fight to the other Sherman, and leaving behind his precious 75mm gun, lost in the collision. To the Marines' amazement, the Japanese commander promptly set the other Sherman ablaze with a rapid succession of direct hits. Said an observer, "She lit up like a Christmas tree." The crew abandoned the burning tank and ran for cover. When at last the Marines encountered heavily dug-in defenders near the western battery of 8-inch coastal guns, the consequences of further advance looked too great. A dozen men were cut down. Without armor or sufficient demolition equipment, this was too much for the Marines. The 3rd Battalion was a mere shadow of its former self. No longer at even half strength, it simply lacked the ability to hold what it had taken. Ryan determined that their gains made them vulnerable to Japanese infiltration or counterattack. He withdrew the troops back into the Red 1 beachhead. By late afternoon, they were dug in compactly on the Bird's beak with the support of a few machine guns and China Gal, whose 75mm gun was gone. Their lines were separated from the nearest Marines on Red, 2 by 600 yards of enemy-held ground. 2,000 miles away in the Hawaiian Islands, Makalapa lay quiet and peaceful in the late afternoon. The day was comfortably breezy and cool, and the clouds scudded low over the surrounding mountains. At Admiral Nimitz's secret mountain headquarters, however, this was not just another routine morning. Rear Admiral Charles Sock McMorris, CINCPAC's intelligent chief of staff, had been up since before dawn. Nimitz had directed the principal commanders of Operation Galvanic to send him information copies of all important communications, and now, in the operations room, they were considering the most recent report. The news from the Gilberts was bad. Makin had not fallen in one fell swoop as had been hoped. Rather, although Turner had reported that the 27th Infantry Division forces landed on schedule and advanced against no opposition at first, Major General Ralph Smith's troops were finding it tough to gain ground. The Japanese had disengaged their few combat forces and successfully withdrawn to new positions in the east. However, at the moment, the big concern was Tarawa. The news from there was worse, far worse. McMorris had been carefully following the developments. He had monitored Major General Julian Smith's message to Howlin' Mad Smith at Makin, which concluded with the ominous words "issue in doubt," requesting release of the V Amphibious Corps reserves, and had taken it immediately to Admiral Nimitz. "The 2nd Division has asked for the force reserve," McMorris reported bluntly. The report came as a shock. A staff officer reminded Nimitz and the others that "issue in doubt" had been the phrase used by Major Devereaux and the Marines at Wake just before that American island had fallen to the enemy in 1941. As an officer recalled, there was a long silence as Nimitz pondered the situation. He sat quietly, revealing no emotion. He had directed that the amphibious assault forces get the hell in and get the hell out, and it was apparent to his staff that he was troubled by the predicament of the Marines at Tarawa. Finally, he said to the naval officers who were expectantly gathered around him, "I've sent in there everything we had, and it's plenty. I don't know why we shouldn't succeed." Along the base of the embattled beachhead at Betio, any Marine private who was not yet dead or wounded could have provided many good reasons.